Right, okay. The next essay plan that we're going to look at is plasticity. So consider the kind of things that you could talk about in plasticity. As always, the first thing you would do, if it was a straightforward describe and evaluate with no kind of careful consideration of the question, what in particular is it asking you? Do you need to tailor it in a certain way? Do you need to apply it? Would be to give a definition. So plasticity is the brain's ability to change and adapt due to experience, so that everything that happens in our everyday life can have an impact on our brain, and therefore it can change and it can increase or decrease in size depending on what happens to us. And the way that we've just kind of considered these is we've looked at 3 different pieces of research and what they tell us about brain plasticity and the way that it can be impacted. So first of all, very briefly, if we have a look at the idea of synaptic pruning, so this is something that happens within, an example of this would be Genie, and how life experience can have an impact on the capabilities of the brain. So I don't know if you can all remember, we looked at a case study a while ago of Genie, who was kept, a girl who was abused by her father and was kept in a room strapped to a potty, and there was no communication. She wasn't able to move. She didn't talk to or communicate with anybody. She wasn't taught any skills at all. And as you move towards adolescence, as you get older, move out of childhood, then you experience a process called synaptic pruning. When you're born, there are far many more synaptic connections than as you are as an adult, and then they gradually, as they're unused, they are removed, so the brain is kind of refined to become really good at processing the information that's required for the environment that you're in, and then any synapses that aren't required, are not useful, are removed. So of course, because of the way that Genie's environment was controlled and reduced, it wasn't made stimulating, wasn't a nice environment to be in, the brain pruned far too many synapses, which then made it very difficult for her. So she did learn language, but she wasn't able to fully ever produce fully grammatical sentences. She wasn't able to have fluent conversation. She was able to make herself understood, but that was it. Her movements never became completely fluid. All of those things potentially because her brain removed and pruned some of those synapses that would have helped that process to happen, but because there wasn't any stimulation or anything in the environment to suggest that, the brain didn't realise that she might need those in the future. Another really good example is that babies are born with the ability to differentiate between almost any sound in any language. So for example, in certain languages there are certain sounds. If we, as an adult speaker of English, and I think it's Japanese is one of them, or maybe Chinese, there's a sound that we can't tell the difference between. If you played one next to the other, they would both sound identical. Played recording A and recording B and said, is there any difference between these sounds? No, they're not different. And the same applies to Japanese and Chinese speakers. They can't necessarily tell the difference between different sounds, and I think it might be the difference between t and th, but I might be wrong. So if we played that to somebody from speaking another language, they wouldn't be able to differentiate between the two. And the idea is babies are born, they turn their heads to both to show that they're different. They know they're different sounds, but as they grow older, because those sounds aren't required for their environment, they don't need to differentiate between them. The brain prunes them at those synapses that allows them to identify the difference away. Okay. Other examples that we've got Boyk, who shows that life experience can have a positive impact on the brain. So whilst synaptic pruning is possibly slightly more depressing because we talk about Genie and abuse, this is a really positive one. So the absolute full details are in your books, in your textbooks, and in your booklets. So hopefully you filled those in carefully in lesson. Because Boyd taught elderly people, had a control group of young people of 20-year-olds and an experimental group of, I think it was about 60-year-olds, but you'll want to check that, and they taught them both to juggle, and they found an increase in grey matter in both groups, not the control, I suppose it wouldn't be a control group, would it? They'd both be experimental groups because they were comparing, and they were comparing repeated measures, so before, how much brain matter they had before and how much their brain matter they had afterwards. So it wouldn't be, they'd both be experimental groups, but it would be repeated measures. And they found in both groups an increase in grey matter, so that's the essentially brain matter, the matter that works in the brain, particularly on kind of the outer edges of the brain, in the increasing grey matter in the visual cortex, although this effect was less seen in the elderly. who also didn't learn to juggle as well. So there was an increase, but there was a more significant increase when they were younger, but it still happened when they were older as well. And also the effects were reversed after they decreased or stopped doing the juggling. But of course the findings were that there was that increase, which supports the idea that the brain can respond to life experiences. So they learn at any age, 20, 60, whatever, they learned to juggle, and they found because they learned a new skill, the brain's evidence plasticity, because it grew and changed with that life experience. Then you've got Goon with the video, who played video games, and they had, this is where the control group came from. It was independent groups. They had an experimental group who played video games 30 minutes every day for 2 months. It was Super Mario Karts, I think. And then they had a control group who didn't, and they found an increase again in grey matter, which is the physical matter which makes up the brain. In the cortex, the hippocampus and the cerebellum, they found lots of new synaptic connections, which was suggested to have improved people's spatial navigation, strategic planning, working memory and motor performance. So that suggests that with training, and again with life experiences, that people's brains can respond to the environment and grow and change. And then we've got Davidson, so other life experiences with meditation, with he had 8 Tibetan practitioners, so 8 Tibetan monks and 10 student volunteers. And when they were student volunteers, received a very small amount of meditation training, but that was it. Whereas obviously the Tibetan monks, they had a huge amount of experience of meditating, and they found in the Tibetan monks that there were greater gamma waves in the brain in monks. Which shows that life experience not only changes the physical structure of the brain, but also the way that the brain works. So it changes brain activity and the way that the brain kind of communicates and understands things. Okay, so all of those show that there are the brain is plastic. It does change with experiences we have in life. It's not just a set size because of how we're born. Okay. And then looking quickly at AO3, you've got methodological issues, so the fact that, and there's absolutely hundreds of these in your books that we talk about as well. So I suppose the strength, you could argue strength would be that they were based in a lab, so they were very, very well controlled, although slightly some of them were artificial, quite unusual environments to be in. It's not often that you're asked to play video games for this set period of time. You're asked to learn to juggle. It's not necessarily natural to real life. But there are certain positives. However, one, Davidson particularly, was a quasi-experiment, so the IV was predetermined, so you couldn't randomly allocate some people to be Tibetan monks and some people to be volunteers. They either came in with that experience, and of course Tibetan monks, the only focus isn't meditation. That wasn't the only two differences between student volunteers and Tibetan monks. There are lots of other differences, so it could be confounding variables caused by not being able to randomly allocate because it's a quasi, so it reduces the validity, so there are some certain problems there. However, there is supporting animal research, and you'd want to structure all of these like P structures, thinking about the words validity, explaining it all afterwards. And they did find an increased number of neurons in rats' brains, particularly in the hippocampus, which is related to making new memories and navigation skills. In the rats, they had independent groups. So some of the rats were given a cage or an environment that was very, very complex and stimulating, and then they gave the other rats a much less stimulating environment, and they found that there were lots of differences in the brain. So clearly environmental impacts have a difference, and of course that links to Jeannie as well. So there were some changes in Jeannie's brain because her brain wasn't as stimulated by the environment as other people maybe who weren't abused were. So of course you could briefly talk about issues with extrapolation. So you could say that there aren't necessarily human and animal brains can be viewed as quite different. They're not quite animal brains aren't necessarily as complex for various different reasons. Although there is other evidence to support the idea of seasonal changes. So we do see seasonal changes, and that's again an environmental thing, and we see those both in humans and animals. So you could have a however on the however sentence, which suggests that there are still some similarities in the brain and how plastic it is and how it changes in response to the environment, and there are similarities between humans and animals, even though humans' brains are more complex. because of all the idea would be that obviously we have essentially evolved from the same environmental pressures, so the same environment. And then of course you can talk about brain scans, so there are lots of different ones used. They make reference to MRI and also EEGs, so Davidson with the electrodes must be EEGs, and the others they were looking at the structure, so they were looking at MRI brain scans. And you could talk about all the differences, so for example the fact, a problem with it is that EEGs can't access the deeper part of the brains and they can't pinpoint with a great deal of accuracy, but they do provide real-time data, so you could talk about that. They're also objective and scientific, and they've been checked, and they do have an element of validity to them. They remove experimental bias, all of those different things. Another thing that you could then go on to talk about would be real-world applications. So I copied and pasted in a journal article from Kuhn's. So he found that there was a significant difference, that parts of the brain grew and developed when they were given video games to play. There's a really interesting comment at the end of that, that it can that therefore certain training, if we know about brain plasticity, we can put certain things in place to improve the quality of people's lives. So for example, video games could be used to counteract the risk factors of illness such as schizophrenia and post-traumatic stress, because one of the risk factors of schizophrenia is smaller hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. So if we could identify people with smaller hippocampi and prefrontal cortexes, then we could say, now you really would benefit from this training that we're going to put in place. You would benefit from playing these kind of video games. They could develop video games that were specifically designed to reduce, to increase the size of the brain to reduce the risk of schizophrenia and post-traumatic stress disorder. So we could put in place preventative measures to treat people's mental health. So see, video games are very good. Okay. The next slide that we'll look at together, because these are presented on the spec together, is functional recovery, which is shorter, so it's unlikely that we'd have as much information. You'd be expected to talk about it individually as a 16-mark question, but of course it is important for you to be aware of. So functional recovery, you talk about the definition, so it's the idea of moving functions from a damaged area of the brain after trauma to other undamaged areas. So it's about having functional recovery means, so we're able to recover from brain functions, recover some of our brain functions so that we can continue to survive and to exist. And there's a couple of different ones. So we've got the one that we talked about in the book and in class was neural unmasking. So you've got lots and lots of synapses or parts of the brain which are dormant. However, as soon as there is increased brain activity around those areas, it wakes them up and they start to act as synapses. So it unmasks those neurons and they can start to work, the synapses start to work and synaptic transmission can happen so the brain can communicate with each other. So the basic idea there, if you think about it a little bit like, I don't know, perhaps like an overflow or storm drain maybe. Say if there was you imagine there's a pipe with lots of water running down it, and suddenly that pipe and the other there's pipes running off it, but none of them are needed because this pipe's perfectly acceptable, it's working enough. However, that pipe develops a blockage, the activity starts to build up, and then the other pipes start to work because the water starts to flow in. The activity is built up there, and so the pipes need to be working to kind of flow and move the activity along. Otherwise, it would stop working. It's the same sort of thing in the brain. If there's a damaged part of the brain that doesn't work, therefore the activity goes to other places, and then that wakes up those dormant neurons and synapses that haven't been working. Another thing we spoke about in class was stem cells. So these are unspecialized cells, so cells that can technically do any role within the body. And the idea is that they either replace dead cells. So if there's cells that have died because of injury, they've been damaged because of injury in the brain, stem cells can replace these cells. So the dead cells are removed and the stem cells replace them. They can also rescue injured cells. So if there were cells that have been damaged due to injury, due to brain damage or something, they can rescue and heal those cells and help them to start working again, or so using their stem cell ability. Or they can create a neural network or pathway from the injured and uninjured bits of the brain, so they can develop almost like a bridge that takes the information away from the damaged part of the brain and flows into a new part of the brain which can work. So replace dead cells, repair injured cells, or create neural pathways. So there's some of the ways that stem cells can work. And then of course we briefly, just so that you're aware, we've also got neural regeneration and neural reorganisation, which we've kind of referred to already, which were mentioned in the specification. So neural regeneration is probably working alongside the stem cells to help those cells start to work again, so to repair themselves, and neural reorganisation would be about neural unmasking, or where the stem cells create a pathway, so it allows them to reorganise the neurons so that they can start to work. Either the information now goes, there's no reorganisation, so the information, the activity goes from the damaged part of the brain to an undamaged part, or there's a reorganisation and those neurons that were dormant are unmasked and now start to take on that activity. And then there's two things that you could talk about here. You've got a piece of research from 2013 who looked at rats. They gave them brain injuries, and half of them then received stem cell treatment and half of them didn't. So they had a stem cell transplant, and they found that as they looked at the rats' brains, that in the ones with the stem cells, they started to see the development of neuron-like cells in the damaged areas. So they were starting to see neuron-like cells replacing where the damage was, and also a stream of stem cells running to the damaged part of the brain. So you could consider both of those. And also you've got the example of Gabby Gifford, who was a case study, who was shot in the brain. So there was an assassination attempt and she was shot. However, she was able to recover a lot of her functions. Not all of them though, so two things you could talk about there was the fact that they weren't all recovered, so it suggests that functional recovery is only successful to a certain point, especially when damage is so significant. But secondly, you could also talk about the fact it's a case study, it's quite unique. Did she ever live a certain type of lifestyle before she experienced the damage? Was there any additional confounding variables? So the idea that she was shot at, though she experienced an assassination attempt, is there a stress element there that could have had a different impact on the way her brain responded? Any of those things, and of course it's a small sample, so lacks population validity as well.